What would drive a son to end the life of the man who gave him everything? It's a question that shocks, horrifies, and leaves you searching for answers you may never fully understand. Yet this is precisely the nightmare that unfolded in the quiet, upscale streets of Los Angeles. A story so twisted it feels ripped from the darkest corners of a Hollywood thriller. Rob Reiner, the legendary filmmaker behind some of the most iconic films of our time, and his wife Michelle, a woman known for her warmth, kindness, and devotion, were found dead in their home on a Sunday morning that started like any other. But what was supposed to be a regular day would turn into a tragedy that shook not just their family, but the entire world. In those first few hours after the discovery, neighbors described the house as eerily silent. The police arrived to a scene that no one could have imagined. 2 lives taken, a family left in chaos, and a son, Nick Reiner, arrested for an act so horrifying that it seemed impossible to reconcile with the images of the boy growing up in a loving household. In his own words, Nick admitted to ending his father's life because he had been removed from the family will. Just one sentence, one confession, but it opened a floodgate of questions, suspicions, and heartbreak. How could a son, raised in comfort and surrounded by love, reach a point where he would commit such an atrocity? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Rob Reiner was 78 years old, a man whose name alone carries decades of cinematic history. He brought stories to life, made the world laugh, cry, and think, and yet, behind the scenes, he was facing battles that few could see. Michelle, 68, his partner in life, who had stood beside him through successes and failures, was gone too. Together, they were the picture of stability, of Hollywood elegance, of a family that seemed untouchable. But the facade cracked in the most violent and tragic way imaginable. What happened inside that luxurious Los Angeles home? How could this family, admired by millions, fall apart so completely and so violently? The answer lies in the shadows of wealth, fame, and the invisible tensions that simmer behind closed doors. Some say it was greed. Others speak of mental health struggles. Some whisper about a history of family conflict, disagreements, and secrets that, over time, festered like a silent poison. All of these elements, combined, created a storm no one could have predicted. And yet, even before the full story came out, the world couldn't stop asking, what did Nick Reiner feel that Sunday morning? Did he plan it? Was it a moment of rage or a carefully orchestrated act? His confession was chilling in its simplicity, but it raised more questions than it answered. The narrative is as complex as it is tragic, filled with twists that will make you question everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and the hidden pressures of fame. Imagine walking into a house where your parents live, a place you've called home all your life. Now imagine that within that home, everything you thought you knew, love, safety, family, is about to be shattered in an instant. It's almost impossible to picture, yet for the Reiner family, this nightmare became reality. The day started like any other. The smell of coffee, the quiet hum of daily routines, perhaps a joke shared over breakfast, a laugh exchanged in the living room. By evening, that laughter was gone. Permanently. Hollywood responded with shock and disbelief. Colleagues, friends, and fans poured out their grief publicly, unable to reconcile the vibrant, talented man they knew with the tragic circumstances of his death. Industry insiders expressed disbelief that anyone, let alone a family member, could be capable of such a crime. And the media ran stories around the clock, dissecting every detail, speculating about motives, and trying to understand the inexplicable. But even in the whirlwind of coverage, one fact stood out. Nick's own words had changed the story forever. He didn't hide behind confusion. He didn't claim an accident. He admitted it. The son of Rob Reiner, a man celebrated for storytelling and artistry, confessed to taking the life of his father, and his mother was caught in the crossfire. Why would removing someone from a will trigger such a catastrophic response? To the casual observer, it might seem inconceivable. But in families with wealth, fame, and power, the dynamics are rarely simple. Money can amplify resentment. Entitlement can twist affection into bitterness, and secrets, even seemingly small ones, can grow into irreparable fractures. Over the coming chapters, We'll explore the layers of this tragedy, the life Rob and Michelle built, the pressures and conflicts Nick faced, the warning signs that may have gone unnoticed, and the shocking truth of what finally pushed him to the edge. And while this story is intensely personal, it's also a lens through which we can examine human nature at its most extreme. What happens when love and resentment collide? When privilege meets entitlement? When family loyalty is tested in ways that leave no room for forgiveness? These questions are not just rhetorical. They are central to understanding the tragedy of the Reiners' final days. Even now, as investigators piece together the timeline, the clues, the testimonies, and the confessions, the world is left grappling with the same unsettling thought. Could this have been prevented? Were there signs we missed? Was this a moment of premeditated violence or the culmination of long-simmering tensions? And most importantly, what does it mean for the people left behind, for the legacy of Rob Reiner, and for the lessons we take from such a catastrophic event? Before we dive deeper into the events that led to that fateful Sunday, it's important to humanize the story. Rob Reiner was more than a filmmaker. He was a father, a husband, a friend, and a creative force whose work touched millions. Michelle was more than a spouse. She was a partner, a confidant, a force of stability and warmth. And Nick, despite his horrific actions, was a son, someone who, at one point, shared laughter and love with the people he ultimately harmed. The contrast between public perception and private reality is stark, and it's exactly what makes this story so compelling and so disturbing. In the coming chapters, we will explore the layers of the Reiners' life, the glamour and the chaos, the joy and the tension, the ordinary and the extraordinary. You will see how a family can appear perfect from the outside while hiding turmoil that ultimately leads to tragedy. You will understand the pressures of legacy, of wealth, of expectation. And you will see, piece by piece, how a day that began like any other became a day that changed everything, and no one saw it coming. But as we start this journey, one question looms over everything. Was this tragedy inevitable, or could it have been stopped? The answer, like much in this story, is complicated. It involves secrets, lies, and a revelation that would stun even those closest to the Reiners. By the end of this exploration, you will not only know what happened, you will understand the human emotions, the misunderstandings, and the pressures that collided to create a nightmare no one could have predicted. What if everything you thought was perfect was really a carefully constructed illusion? The Reiners were the image of Hollywood success and family bliss. Rob Reiner, the acclaimed director, actor, and writer, had a career that spanned decades. From This Is Spinal Tap to A Few Good Men, his name was synonymous with creativity, wit, and cinematic excellence. Michelle Reiner, his partner in life, exuded elegance and warmth, a woman who supported Rob through every project, premiere, and award ceremony. Together, they were the ideal Hollywood couple, admired by colleagues, friends, and fans alike. Yet beneath the glossy surface, tensions were quietly brewing. From the outside, the Reiners' life appeared flawless. Their home in an upscale Los Angeles neighborhood, carefully decorated and maintained, radiated success. Their social calendar was packed with premieres, charity events, and gatherings with other Hollywood elites. Friends described them as generous, kind, and deeply committed to family. And yet, those closest to them quietly acknowledged that not everything was as perfect as it seemed. Arguments, disagreements, and unspoken resentments simmered beneath the surface. One of the earliest indicators of tension came from within the family itself. Nick Reiner, their only son, had grown up in comfort, attending elite schools and traveling with the family. On the outside, he seemed like any privileged child, bright, ambitious, and surrounded by love. But as he matured, cracks began to appear. Sources close to the family reported frequent disagreements between Nick and Rob, often revolving around expectations, responsibilities, and yes, money. While Rob had achieved professional success and personal acclaim, Nick reportedly struggled with his own identity and purpose, creating friction that was rarely visible to outsiders. Emotional tension in families is often invisible to the world. People see smiles at events, handshakes at premieres, and snapshots of togetherness on social media. What they don't see are the quiet moments behind closed doors. The sighs of frustration, the whispered arguments, the feelings of being unappreciated or overlooked. According to insiders, the Reiners were no exception. Family dinners, once filled with laughter and conversation, had reportedly grown tense in the months leading up to the tragedy. Discussions that should have been routine, like planning vacations or attending events, sometimes ended in anger or withdrawal. Money, of course, can magnify tensions in any family, especially one with substantial wealth. Rob and Michelle were known to have amassed significant assets, from successful films to investments and properties. For most people, money brings comfort. For others, it can fuel envy and resentment. Nick Reiner, it seems, began to perceive his inheritance as a measure of his worth, a point of contention that would later become tragically significant. Friends and associates reported that he felt slighted and excluded from certain family decisions, especially those involving financial matters. The idea of being removed from his father's will, when it happened, reportedly triggered deep feelings of betrayal. But tension alone does not lead to tragedy. Something else was at play: the complex dynamics of love, expectation, and unspoken grievances. Rob Reiner was known as a loving father, but he was also a man of principles, someone who expected respect, discipline, and maturity. Michelle, equally devoted, supported these values, emphasizing personal responsibility and accountability. For Nick, who struggled with his own sense of entitlement and identity, this often created conflict. What seemed like guidance to some felt like control to him, and the resulting friction quietly shaped the family's private world. Consider the irony. Rob Reiner, a man who told stories about human flaws, contradictions, and moral dilemmas on the big screen, faced similar struggles in real life. He had explored characters who wrestled with guilt, envy, and family conflict, yet he could not escape the complexities of these very dynamics in his own household. It's a bitter paradox, but one that underscores a painful truth. No amount of fame, talent, or success can shield a family from internal discord. Neighbors reported that the Reiner household was generally quiet, even reserved. There were occasional parties, gatherings, and events, but for the most part, the couple preferred privacy. It was in these quiet moments that tension was perhaps most evident. Witnesses recalled seeing Nick alone at times, pacing or talking on the phone, often looking frustrated or agitated. While no one could have predicted what would happen, these small glimpses hinted at a brewing storm. A storm that would culminate in an event so shocking, it would dominate headlines around the world. The public rarely sees the duality of life for those in the spotlight. On the one hand, you have accolades, parties, and admiration. On the other, a private world filled with expectations, disappointments, and unresolved conflicts. For the Reiners, this duality was stark. Rob's professional life was flourishing. He was respected, celebrated, and continuously working on projects that inspired audiences worldwide. Yet at home, the family dynamics were far less harmonious, simmering with tension that no public accolade could alleviate. And yet, there were moments of normalcy, moments that made the eventual tragedy even more jarring. Family vacations, shared jokes, and casual conversations painted a picture of love and stability. Friends emphasized that Nick had, at times, shown warmth and affection, making his later actions almost impossible to reconcile. How could someone capable of laughter and love commit an act of such unthinkable violence? The answer, as we will uncover, lies in the intersection of emotion, entitlement, and the breaking point that he ultimately reached. In analyzing the Reiner family dynamics, it's also critical to understand the role of external pressures. Hollywood is a world where scrutiny, public perception, and constant judgment can weigh heavily on a family. The Reiners, like many in the industry, were under the microscope. Every misstep, every disagreement, could be amplified in the media. This external pressure likely compounded internal tensions, adding layers of stress that intensified personal grievances. Despite the outward appearance of a perfect life, the Reiner story is a reminder that perfection is often an illusion. Beneath the laughter, the achievements, and the smiles lay a network of conflicts, resentments, and unspoken challenges. The contrast between public perception and private reality is one of the most striking elements of this tragedy. What the world saw as a model family was, in fact, a family teetering on the edge of a collapse that no one anticipated. As we move forward into the events that led to that fateful Sunday, it's crucial to remember this. Appearances can deceive. Love, success, and legacy do not make a family immune to conflict. Wealth does not prevent resentment, and fame does not shield against the complexities of human emotion. The Reiners were living proof that even the most admired families can harbor hidden fractures that, under certain conditions, can shatter in ways that leave devastation behind. And just when it seemed the family might weather the storm, when friends believed tensions could be managed or reconciled, one incident set everything into motion. A single conversation, a decision, a perceived slight, details we will explore in the next chapter, created a ripple effect that no one could have predicted. This moment, seemingly minor at the time, would prove to be a turning point, leading directly to the shocking events that followed. But what was this pivotal moment? And how could it trigger consequences so catastrophic that the Reiner household would never be the same? The answers lie in the private interactions, the quiet arguments, and the choices made behind closed doors. Choices that would ultimately culminate in a tragedy no one saw coming. Sunday morning started like any other. The sun rose over the quiet, tree-lined streets of Los Angeles, casting a warm glow over the upscale homes in the neighborhood. Rob Reiner sipped his morning coffee in the kitchen, Michelle humming softly as she prepared breakfast. From the outside, it was a picture-perfect moment, a couple who had built a life of comfort, success, and admiration, greeting the day with the routines that had defined their decades together. But beneath the calm surface, tension lingered like an invisible storm cloud. Rob had recently made changes to his will. While most families manage such matters quietly, the Reiners' circumstances made this particular decision explosive. Nick Reiner, their only son, had learned that he would be removed from the will. To most observers, it might seem like a simple legal adjustment, a matter of estate planning. But for Nick, it was a devastating blow. Reports suggest he had long felt slighted, unappreciated, and resentful, perceiving the will as a reflection of his worth within the family. What might have been resolved through conversation had instead festered, building a pressure cooker of frustration, anger, and perceived betrayal. By mid-morning, friends and neighbors would later recount that Nick's behavior was noticeably off. He appeared tense, distracted, and unusually quiet, walking through the house with an intensity that contrasted sharply with the calm atmosphere around him. No one at that point could have imagined what was about to unfold. The moment where frustration would erupt into irreversible tragedy. Small warning signs often go unnoticed, especially in households accustomed to high emotions and intense personalities. A slammed door here, a muttered complaint there, could be interpreted as ordinary tension between family members. But in the Reiner household, these small cues were precursors, subtle indicators of a deeper emotional fracture. Rob and Michelle, focused on their routines, and perhaps believing that familial tension was temporary, likely did not anticipate the magnitude of the day's events. Around mid-afternoon, the first unusual event occurred. Sources close to the family later reported that Nick had a heated discussion with Rob in the living room. While the specifics remain confidential, witnesses suggest that it revolved around the will and Nick's perceived exclusion. The conversation escalated quickly, voices raised, emotions boiling over. A dispute that might have been resolved in calmer circumstances spiraled, leaving a lingering sense of unease that permeated the house. Moments like this can seem minor in hindsight, almost inconsequential, yet in tragic stories, they often serve as the tipping point. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, the mundane becomes catastrophic, and a single decision can ignite a chain reaction that no one could have foreseen. The Reiners' tragedy is a stark example of this phenomenon, how accumulated tension, feelings of betrayal, and a sense of injustice can converge to create an explosive situation. Even as the conversation unfolded, neighbors remained oblivious. From the outside, the house appeared normal. The cars were in the driveway, the doors locked as usual, and the sounds of daily life filtered faintly through the walls. Yet inside, the family was on the brink. Every raised voice, every expression of anger or frustration, every subtle act of defiance added to the growing intensity of the moment. In retrospect, these were the last signs of ordinary life before the world changed forever. By late afternoon, the tension had reached a critical point. Nick, reportedly fueled by a mix of anger, resentment, and perceived injustice, took actions that would shock even those closest to him. While the exact details are part of the ongoing investigation, the result was devastating. Both Rob and Michelle Reiner were found dead in their home. What had started as a morning of normalcy had escalated into a catastrophe so profound it stunned neighbors, friends, and the entire nation. The police were called to the scene amid frantic 911 calls from neighbors who noticed unusual activity or a lack of response from the household. Investigators described the scene as heartbreaking and surreal, a home that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now marked by tragedy. Tragedy and loss. It was immediately clear that the deaths were not the result of an accident. The circumstances pointed to an act of deliberate violence, an unthinkable betrayal by someone within the family. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Headlines around the world declared the shocking news. The filmmaker Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle had been killed, and their son Nick was in custody. Social media erupted with disbelief, grief, and speculation. How could a son commit such an act? What had led to this devastating outcome? Fans and colleagues alike struggled to reconcile the public persona of the Reiners, a family admired for decades, with the private horror that had unfolded. In the hours following the discovery, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline. The goal was to understand how a day that began like any other could end in catastrophe. Surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements were analyzed to reconstruct the sequence of events. While some details remained confidential, it was evident that the tragedy had not been spontaneous. The events of the day reflected a culmination of tension, resentment, and emotional pressure that reached a breaking point. Yet, even amid the investigation, certain aspects of the story remained puzzling. Why did Nick act at that precise moment? Were there opportunities to intervene, signs that friends or family could have recognized, or warning signals that went unnoticed? These questions would dominate the media and public discourse in the days and weeks that followed. Analysts and psychologists began examining family dynamics, mental health, and the pressures of wealth and fame to understand what might drive such an unimaginable act. Despite the shock and horror, one thing became undeniably clear. The tragedy was not merely the result of one day's events. It was the product of long-standing tensions, unaddressed grievances, and emotions that had been quietly escalating for years. The Sunday that changed everything was simply the moment when all those factors collided in the most devastating way possible. And yet, for those who knew the Reiners best, there were still questions that refused to be answered. How had Nick's feelings of exclusion and resentment reached such a destructive intensity? Could anyone have anticipated the outcome? And what, if anything, could have prevented the escalation that ended in such tragedy? Even as police began their initial investigation, it became apparent that the story was far more complex than a simple act of violence. Nick's motives, his state of mind, and the influence of years of family tension were all factors that investigators needed to consider. The narrative was shifting from a shocking headline to a deeper exploration of human behavior, family dynamics, and the consequences of unresolved conflict. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. While the world was reeling from the immediate events, investigators and those closest to the family would soon uncover details that made the tragedy even more incomprehensible. Actions, decisions, and emotions that had seemed minor or routine in hindsight were revealed to be critical components in the chain of events leading to the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner. What happens when the person you trust most becomes the one who shatters everything you thought you knew? That is the question the world grappled with when Nick Reiner, the only son of Rob and Michelle Reiner, confessed to ending their lives. The confession didn't come quietly. It sent shockwaves through Los Angeles, Hollywood, and beyond, sparking a media frenzy, public outrage, and deep, unsettling questions about family, loyalty, and human nature. The first reports of Nick's arrest were surreal. Police sources described him as calm, almost detached, as officers read him his rights. Behind the scenes, detectives were trying to piece together how the son of one of Hollywood's most beloved figures could commit such a horrifying act. And then came the statement that would stun everyone. "I ended his life because he removed me from his will." Just like that, decades of admiration, respect, and love were shattered in a single sentence. This confession opened the floodgates of speculation. What could have driven Nick to such an extreme? Was it purely greed? Was it the culmination of years of emotional neglect or unresolved tension? Or was there something deeper, darker, lurking beneath the surface of a life the public had always perceived as ideal? Psychologists and criminal experts would later weigh in, describing a combination of entitlement, resentment, and perceived betrayal that can, in extreme cases, push individuals toward irreversible violence. Friends and colleagues of the Reiners were left in disbelief. People who had known Nick since childhood described him as intelligent, charming, and at times, sensitive. A son who laughed with his parents, shared jokes, and engaged in ordinary family life. How could someone with that outward demeanor commit such an act? It is a question that has haunted investigators, journalists, and the public alike. The confession also revealed a cold calculation. It wasn't a crime of passion or an accident. Nick's statement implied premeditation, a conscious decision rooted in anger and perceived injustice. Removing someone from a will is, for most families, a painful but legal matter. For Nick, it became a trigger, igniting emotions that had been simmering for years. According to sources close to the investigation, this sense of exclusion and betrayal had been building quietly, unaddressed, and ultimately, explosively. Immediately after the confession, law enforcement worked to corroborate his account. They reviewed phone records, emails, and witness statements, seeking to reconstruct the timeline and understand the circumstances leading to the tragedy. What they found was both chilling and revealing. Moments of tension, private arguments, and subtle indications that the relationship between father and son had been deteriorating long before that fateful day. Nick's confession also exposed a deeper fracture within the family. Michelle Reiner, his mother, was described as having been caught in the middle of ongoing conflicts. She was reportedly devoted to both her husband and son, trying to maintain peace and stability while navigating the emotional turbulence that had developed over years. Her death, alongside Rob's, underscored the devastating consequences of unresolved tension and familial strife. The world reacted in shock. Headlines screamed across television screens, websites, and social media feeds. Rob and Michelle Reiner killed by son. Nick Reiner confesses in shocking statement. Hollywood in mourning after tragic family deaths. Celebrities, friends, and colleagues expressed disbelief, grief, and sadness, struggling to reconcile the image of the Reiners as a loving family with the reality of the tragedy. Fans sent messages of support and condolence, while others were left grappling with anger and confusion. Psychologists examining the case explained that Nick's confession reflects a rare but documented pattern. Individuals with a sense of entitlement and long-standing resentment can react violently when they feel wronged, particularly in families with wealth and public prominence. In Nick's case, the combination of perceived exclusion, familial tension, and emotional instability appears to have created a perfect storm that culminated in tragedy. But the confession also raised additional questions. How long had Nick been planning this act? Were there warning signs that friends, neighbors, or family could have recognized? Could intervention have prevented the deaths of Rob and Michelle? The answers remain complex, and the investigation continues to uncover layers of emotional, psychological, and logistical details that shed light on the sequence of events. At the heart of the confession lies a chilling reality. Familial bonds, even those forged through love and shared history, can fracture under the weight of resentment, perceived betrayal, and unresolved conflict. Nick's statement didn't just explain his motive. It highlighted a universal truth about human behavior, that even the strongest relationships can crumble when communication, empathy, and understanding break down. In the aftermath, the public was left grappling with a disturbing paradox. How could a son confess to such a crime with apparent calm, while those around him were plunged into grief and disbelief? The juxtaposition between the emotional devastation experienced by family and friends and the calculated nature of Nick's actions created a tension that captivated investigators, journalists, and the public alike. As more details emerged, it became clear that Nick's actions were not impulsive. Friends reported that he had been unusually withdrawn in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, spending long periods alone and expressing frustration over perceived slights. Investigators began to see a pattern. The confession was the culmination of escalating tension, resentment, and internal conflict that had been building for months, perhaps even years. Yet, even as the public struggled to process the confession, there was a lingering question that haunted everyone. What about Rob and Michelle's final moments? What did they know? Could they have anticipated the danger, even subconsciously? Early reports suggested that the couple may have sensed tension or unease in the days before the tragedy, but the exact details remain uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the final hours of their lives were marked by ordinary routines that masked extraordinary danger. This confession also forced a reckoning with Hollywood itself. The industry that had celebrated Rob Reiner's career now faced uncomfortable questions about the pressures of fame, the dynamics of public and private life, and the hidden struggles of those living in the spotlight. What appeared glamorous from the outside often concealed private struggles, frustrations, and conflicts that the public rarely sees. And yet, despite the horror of the confession, the story was far from complete. While Nick had admitted to his actions and explained his motive, investigators would soon uncover additional details that complicated the narrative even further. Evidence, witness accounts, and previously hidden communications suggested that the events of that day involved more than just a single act of rage, that layers of secrecy, miscommunication, and hidden tension had set the stage for the ultimate tragedy. The confession, while shocking, was only the beginning. It exposed the motive, but it also opened the door to a deeper exploration of family dynamics, personal grievances, and the hidden forces that can drive someone to commit an unthinkable act. It raised questions about human nature, the fragility of familial bonds, and the catastrophic consequences when resentment, entitlement, and perceived injustice collide. And just when it seemed the story had reached its shocking peak, investigators and insiders began to uncover details that were even more disturbing. Evidence suggested that the events were not simply the result of a single conversation or decision, but the outcome of years of unresolved tension, emotional neglect, and subtle warning signs that had been overlooked or ignored. What if the place you consider the safest in the world, your own home, turns out to be the scene of unimaginable tragedy? For Rob and Michelle Reiner, their Los Angeles mansion had always been a sanctuary, a place where work, fame, and the pressures of the outside world could be left at the door. But on that fateful Sunday, the home became a silent witness to a horror no one could have imagined. Detectives entering the Reiner household described a scene that was both familiar and shocking. The decor reflected decades of Hollywood success. Walls lined with movie posters, awards gleaming in carefully lit displays, photographs capturing moments of family joy and professional triumph. The air still carried the faint scent of morning coffee, and the home's elegance remained intact. Yet amid this calm and familiarity lay the remnants of a violent act that had shattered the lives of two people who had spent years building a life together. The investigators quickly noted that nothing appeared immediately stolen or out of place. There were no signs of a break-in, no forced entry. Everything suggested that the tragedy had come from within, someone who had access, someone trusted. And that realization made the crime even more shocking. The house that had once been a symbol of comfort and safety was now a stark reminder of betrayal. As the detectives moved through the rooms, they observed subtle signs of tension that, in hindsight, might have hinted at underlying issues. A chair slightly askew. Personal items moved from their usual places. Notes or messages left on counters. While these details could be interpreted in many ways, combined with Nick's confession, they painted a portrait of a home where conflict had quietly simmered beneath the surface. Neighbors would later recount unusual occurrences in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. A car parked outside for hours, late-night visitors, or brief but heated conversations overheard through open windows. These small signs, innocuous on their own, gained a chilling significance after the events. It was a reminder of how domestic spaces, while outwardly normal, can conceal deep emotional turmoil. Inside the Reiner home, investigators also found traces of digital activity that offered additional insight into the family's dynamics. Emails, text messages, and phone records suggested ongoing disputes about the will, financial responsibilities, and personal grievances. While nothing explicitly predicted the tragic outcome, the communications revealed a pattern of miscommunication, frustration, and escalating tension between Nick and his parents. One of the most striking elements uncovered in the household was evidence of ordinary life, items that humanized Rob and Michelle even in death. Coffee cups on the counter, books left open on the sofa, a pair of reading glasses forgotten on a bedside table. These mundane objects contrasted sharply with the violence that had occurred, highlighting the cruel randomness of the tragedy. It reminded everyone that life can be shattered in an instant, regardless of wealth, fame, or perceived security. Michelle's personal spaces offered particularly poignant insights. Her closet, filled with carefully arranged clothing, reflected a woman who took pride in her appearance and her home. Her office contained notes, correspondence, and mementos that suggested she was deeply involved in both the family's personal and financial affairs. Friends described her as organized, attentive, and deeply protective of her family. The discovery of her life's details and the aftermath underscored the senselessness of the loss. Investigators also focused on areas where tension had reportedly occurred. The living room, where Rob and Nick had argued earlier that day, became a focal point. Furniture placement, the position of objects, and traces of recent movement were carefully documented. These subtle clues, combined with forensic evidence, helped construct a timeline of the events leading to the tragedy. They suggested that what had seemed like an ordinary argument escalated into a catastrophic confrontation. Throughout the investigation, one theme became increasingly clear. The Reiner household, while outwardly elegant and organized, had been a stage for unspoken conflict. Arguments, frustrations, and grievances that may have seemed minor to an outsider had built over time, creating an emotional landscape fraught with tension. The home, a symbol of stability and success, had become a crucible for tragedy. Yet the home also revealed moments of tenderness, moments that made the eventual horror even more heartbreaking. Photographs of family vacations, award ceremonies, and candid moments captured Rob and Michelle's love for one another and for their son. Items like a shared journal, letters, or notes left for each other suggested a couple deeply connected, trying to maintain their bond despite underlying challenges. These glimpses of love and normalcy made the contrast with the violence even more striking. The juxtaposition of ordinary life and extreme tragedy is a recurring theme in stories like this. Homes are places where families experience both joy and conflict, where love and resentment coexist, sometimes side by side. In the Reiner household, this duality was starkly evident. It was a home filled with memories, achievements, and personal touches, yet it became the site of one of the most shocking acts of familial betrayal in recent Hollywood history. Even with the forensic evidence, the investigators faced the challenge of reconstructing the precise sequence of events. Was the violence sudden, a spontaneous eruption of anger, or had it been planned? Were there opportunities for intervention, or were the circumstances such that the tragedy was inevitable once tensions had escalated? Each piece of evidence, from the position of objects to digital footprints, provided clues, but no single element could fully explain why a son would take such drastic action against his own parents. In this house, where life had once been ordinary and secure, the investigators found layers of complexity. Subtle indicators of mental and emotional strain, evidence of miscommunication, and the normal chaos of family life all contributed to a volatile environment. The home, once a haven, became a silent witness to the culmination of years of tension, frustration, and unspoken grievances. The discovery inside the household also highlighted the importance of understanding human behavior in its full complexity. Actions that might appear irrational or inexplicable often have roots in emotions, perceptions, and psychological factors that build over time. In the case of the Reiners, the tragedy was not a single isolated incident, but rather the outcome of a complex interplay of family dynamics, personal grievances, and perceived injustices. As investigators continued their work, one chilling realization emerged. Every object, every trace, every detail in the Reiner home told part of the story. From the coffee cups on the counter to the disarray in the living room, the environment reflected a family in crisis, a household on the brink of catastrophe. Each clue, when pieced together, helped illuminate the path that led to the shocking deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner. And yet, despite the meticulous reconstruction, the full picture was still emerging. Hidden behind the walls, beneath the carefully arranged furnishings, and in the silent spaces of the home were secrets and details that had yet to be revealed. These would later become crucial to understanding not just what happened, but why it happened. The emotional, psychological, and situational factors that drove Nick Reiner to commit the unthinkable. But the most unsettling truth about the Reiner household was this. What appeared to be ordinary life was anything but. Every family has tension, every home has conflict, but few result in tragedy. In this house, the ordinary had collided with the extraordinary, creating a perfect storm that no one could have anticipated. And just when it seemed the home had revealed all its secrets, investigators discovered evidence that would shift the narrative once again. A clue so unexpected it would force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about that fateful day. Money, legacy, inheritance, words that might seem ordinary, even mundane, until they become the catalyst for something unthinkable. For the Reiner family, the family will, a legal document outlining the distribution of Rob and Michelle's considerable estate, became the trigger that would forever alter the course of their lives. It wasn't just paper. It was the final, tangible measure of perceived love, loyalty, and recognition. And in Nick Reiner's mind, being removed from it was more than a financial slight. It was a declaration that he no longer mattered. Rob Reiner had spent decades building a legacy. His career, spanning movies, television, and political activism, made him a household name. Michelle, by his side, helped manage both the household and philanthropic commitments, ensuring that the family's success translated into stability. Their wealth was considerable. Multiple properties, significant assets, and a bank account that reflected decades of Hollywood success. The will was not just a legal formality. It was the culmination of decades of hard work and planning. According to sources close to the family, the decision to remove Nick from the will was not sudden. It was a gradual process, influenced by repeated disagreements, frustrations, and Nick's increasing sense of entitlement. Friends describe conversations where Rob expressed concern about Nick's behavior, suggesting that the son needed to demonstrate responsibility and maturity before inheriting a portion of the estate. Michelle reportedly supported this decision, believing it was in both the family's best interest and Nick's long-term growth. But to Nick, the decision was a betrayal. In his eyes, it confirmed long-held suspicions that he was undervalued, misunderstood, and excluded from the family's inner circle. It wasn't just about money. It was about recognition, respect, and validation from the people whose approval mattered most. And when that validation was removed, something inside him snapped. Legal experts reviewing the case noted that being removed from a will, while emotionally painful, is rarely a motive for murder. Yet in extreme cases, especially where wealth, entitlement, and perceived injustice intersect, the result can be catastrophic. Nick's confession, stating that he acted because of his removal from the will, fits into this rare but documented psychological phenomenon, a moment where perceived betrayal and long-standing resentment override rational thought, empathy, and moral judgment. The will itself became a focal point of both investigation and media coverage. Journalists speculated about the specifics. Was Nick initially included and later removed? Were there conditions tied to inheritance? Were there other factors, such as access to trusts or family properties, that intensified his sense of grievance? While the exact details of the will remain confidential, investigators emphasized that its contents were central to understanding motive, particularly given Nick's explicit admission. Friends and colleagues of the family offered insight into the underlying dynamics. They described Nick as someone who had long struggled with feelings of inadequacy, often comparing himself to his parents' accomplishments and expecting rewards that matched his self-perceived worth. When the will removed him from what he saw as his rightful inheritance, It became a symbol of rejection, a tangible proof that he was not valued in the way he believed he should be. The emotional weight of this perceived injustice cannot be overstated. Being cut out of a will may seem trivial to some, but in families with wealth, fame, and high expectations, it can feel like a complete erasure of identity. For Nick, it was not merely a financial setback. It was a personal, existential blow. The combination of resentment, frustration, and long-standing tension with his father created an emotional tinderbox, ready to ignite. Psychologists analyzing the case have suggested that the situation was compounded by entitlement and distorted perception. Nick reportedly believed that the wealth and recognition he saw around him were owed to him, not earned by his parents. When reality contradicted this belief, his frustration escalated into rage. In other words, the will wasn't just a legal document. It was the spark in a volatile emotional landscape. Even as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't the first disagreement between father and son over money or recognition. Sources suggest there had been previous conversations, sometimes heated, about access to funds, responsibilities, and expectations. Friends noted that Nick occasionally vented privately about feeling excluded or unappreciated. These small conflicts, left unresolved, became part of the emotional buildup that culminated in tragedy. The will also revealed a stark reality about family dynamics. Decisions that may seem practical and necessary, protecting an inheritance, ensuring responsible management of assets, can carry unintended emotional consequences. For the Reiners, a well-intentioned legal decision intersected with years of emotional tension, resentment, and perceived injustice, creating the perfect conditions for catastrophe. Law enforcement officials highlighted another chilling aspect: Nick's awareness of the consequences of his actions. His confession was clear and deliberate. He had reflected on the removal from the will, and instead of seeking reconciliation, dialogue, or other resolution, he allowed anger to consume him. The will had become not just a legal issue, but a symbolic justification for an act that would forever shatter the family. Public reaction to this revelation was intense. Social media platforms filled with commentary, ranging from shock and horror to attempts to rationalize or understand his motives. Experts discussed the psychological underpinnings, how perceived entitlement, ego, and unresolved emotional tension can trigger extreme behavior. The conversation became a national discussion on family dynamics, mental health, and the dangerous intersections of wealth and emotion. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the will's role in the tragedy was its stark reminder that seemingly ordinary decisions can have extraordinary consequences. A legal document, a routine revision, something most people would handle quietly, became the catalyst for the ultimate familial betrayal. The irony is brutal. A symbol of legacy and family planning became the instrument, psychologically, if not directly, of destruction. And as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered even more unsettling evidence. Communications between Nick and his parents suggested that discussions about the will had escalated in intensity over time. Texts, emails, and private notes reflected not just frustration, but a growing emotional divide, a fracture in understanding and connection. Each message, each exchange, added weight to the narrative. This was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a prolonged emotional struggle. Friends of the family emphasized that Rob and Michelle likely never imagined that the will would be interpreted in such a devastating way. They were meticulous, careful, and thoughtful in planning their estate, aiming to protect the family and ensure fairness. Yet, the human element, emotion, perception, and resentment, transformed a rational decision into a flashpoint for tragedy. And just when it seemed the motive was fully understood, investigators would uncover details that complicated the story even further. Evidence emerged suggesting that the emotional impact of the will was intertwined with other personal grievances and unresolved conflicts, creating a complex web of motives, pressures, and triggers. The removal from the will, while central, was only one piece of a larger puzzle that would reveal the depth of familial dysfunction. It was a Sunday like any other. Or so it seemed. But in the quiet hours leading up to the tragedy, the Reiner household was a tinderbox of tension, anticipation, and unspoken conflict. To the outside world, Rob and Michelle's home remained calm, elegant, and orderly. Inside, however, subtle signs hinted at a storm building to catastrophic proportions. Every glance, every exchange, every movement carried weight, and the pressure was about to snap. The morning had started peacefully. Rob Reiner, meticulous and disciplined as ever, had begun his day with routine tasks, reading correspondence, reviewing scripts, and enjoying a quiet cup of coffee. Michelle, equally dedicated, moved through the house with her characteristic grace, preparing breakfast and checking in on household matters. Yet, even amid these ordinary routines, there were hints of friction, subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but powerful in their emotional resonance. Nick Reiner's behavior that morning was unusual. Friends and neighbors later described him as unusually withdrawn, pacing through the home with a tension that seemed to radiate outward. He was observed speaking in hushed tones on the phone, sometimes agitated, sometimes silent. Sources suggest that these conversations may have involved old grievances and unresolved frustrations, both with his parents and with his own perception of being wronged. Every movement he made, every word he muttered, reflected a mind wrestling with anger and a sense of injustice. Tension between parent and child is a common occurrence in many households, but the Reiner family situation was compounded by years of unresolved emotional conflict. Disagreements over money, recognition, and personal responsibility had simmered beneath the surface for months, perhaps even years. While Rob and Michelle had likely hoped these issues could be managed through conversation and guidance, Nick's perception was different. To him, these tensions were not minor disagreements, but evidence of a profound betrayal. By mid-morning, the emotional climate in the house had intensified. Sources close to the investigation later revealed that Nick and Rob had an argument in the living room, the kind of dispute that starts small but escalates quickly when resentment is involved. Voices reportedly rose, emotions flared, and past grievances were dredged up alongside current frustrations. For Nick, this confrontation was the tipping point, the culmination of years of feeling excluded, undervalued, and ultimately erased. At the same time, Michelle reportedly tried to mediate, attempting to calm the escalating tension. Friends describe her as deeply empathetic, someone who always sought to maintain harmony. But mediation was not enough. The emotional charge in the room had reached a critical level, and rational discussion gave way to reaction as years of unresolved resentment surged to the surface. The sequence of events that followed was rapid and tragic. Nick's confession later confirmed that his actions were deliberate, fueled by a combination of anger, betrayal, and the emotional impact of being removed from the will. What may have seemed like a simple argument to an observer quickly became a catastrophic confrontation. The very home that had been a sanctuary turned into the setting for an unthinkable act, a violent rupture that destroyed lives and stunned a community. Investigators later reconstructed the timeline, noting how quickly events escalated. Objects were moved, voices raised, and ordinary household spaces became sites of tension. The living room, where family conversations normally occurred, became a focal point of the conflict. The contrast between normal domestic life, furniture arranged for comfort, books and photographs lining the shelves, and the intensity of the confrontation created a chilling backdrop for what was about to occur. This stage of the tragedy highlights a critical reality. Many disasters are preceded by subtle, often overlooked signals. Small acts of frustration, brief arguments, or quiet withdrawals may seem insignificant in the moment, yet they can signal emotional turbulence that, if unaddressed, may spiral into violence. In the Reiner household, these moments were the calm before the storm, a storm that would soon explode in the most devastating way imaginable. By early afternoon, the tension reached its peak. Witnesses described Nick as increasingly agitated, moving with a sense of purpose and intensity that reflected his internal state. Reports suggest he was fixated on the perceived injustice of being cut from the will, seeing his parents' actions not just as legal decisions, but as personal attacks. The emotional pressure had become unbearable, creating a psychological environment where extreme actions seemed, to him, justified. Michelle and Rob, in contrast, remained focused on maintaining normalcy. They went about their routines, likely unaware of the immediacy of the danger. Friends later noted that the couple had a long-standing habit of resolving conflicts through conversation and compromise, perhaps underestimating the depth of Nick's emotional turmoil. This disparity between perception and reality is often a tragic feature of family violence. Those closest to the perpetrator may be blind to the risk until it is too late. Forensic evidence later revealed small but telling signs of the escalation. Items in the home were displaced, objects that should have been stationary were moved, and traces of a struggle were evident. These details, combined with Nick's confession, painted a picture of a confrontation that escalated quickly, leaving little time for intervention. The physical environment mirrored the emotional chaos. An ordinary, peaceful home transformed into a scene of horror within hours. Even amid the horror, there were fleeting moments of human connection. Investigators and friends noted evidence of attempts at dialogue, gestures of reconciliation, and brief pauses in the conflict. These moments, however, were insufficient to defuse the situation. The buildup of years of resentment and perceived betrayal had created a tension too great to release peacefully. Psychologists examining the case emphasized the role of perception in the escalation. Nick's interpretation of events, particularly the removal from the will, created a narrative in his mind that justified extreme action. This distorted perception, compounded by years of unresolved emotional conflict, created conditions where tragedy became almost inevitable. It is a stark reminder that in family dynamics, perception can be as powerful as reality, shaping decisions in ways that defy logic and reason. And then, as afternoon approached, the moments leading up to disaster converged. A single argument, a glance, a word, in combination with years of unresolved tension, became the spark that ignited the ultimate catastrophe. In the span of minutes, ordinary life within the Reiner household collapsed, leaving behind devastation, grief, and questions that would haunt investigators and the public for years to come. The story of those final hours is a testament to the fragility of family bonds under pressure. The Reiner household, filled with decades of love, achievement, and memories, became a crucible for tragedy. A reminder that even in the most celebrated families, hidden fractures can erupt with devastating force. And just when it seemed the timeline had reached its darkest point, investigators would uncover a chilling detail, something that suggested the tragedy was even more calculated, more deliberate, and more horrifying than anyone had yet imagined. The moment the authorities arrived at the Reiner residence, the world shifted from disbelief to an intense, high-stakes investigation. Police cars lined the quiet Los Angeles street, their lights cutting through the afternoon haze, flashing red and blue against the elegant facade of a home that had once symbolized safety, comfort, and family unity. Inside, detectives faced a scene that would challenge even the most experienced investigators. A luxurious household transformed overnight into a site of unfathomable tragedy. The investigation began with the basics: secure the scene, preserve evidence, and establish a timeline. Forensic teams moved methodically, photographing every angle, examining every detail, and collecting traces of what had occurred. It quickly became evident that the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner were not accidents. Every indication pointed to deliberate, violent action. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of intrusion from outside the family. The house itself seemed to tell a story of domestic escalation, a private storm that had reached its catastrophic conclusion. Law enforcement officials were initially faced with an emotional and psychological challenge as well. Cases involving family members as perpetrators are notoriously complex. Unlike crimes committed by strangers, these events involve layers of interpersonal history, deep-seated emotions, and motivations that are difficult to untangle. In this case, the confessed involvement of Nick Reiner brought both clarity and complexity. While investigators now had a primary suspect, the why remained layered, nuanced, and critical to understanding the full picture. Nick's arrest was swift. He reportedly remained calm, almost unnervingly composed, when confronted by law enforcement. His confession, blunt, shocking, and chilling, immediately framed the investigation. "I ended his life because he removed me from his will," he stated, an admission that would dominate headlines worldwide. But detectives knew that while motive seemed clear, it was essential to verify every aspect: timelines, communications, behavioral patterns, and forensic evidence. Nothing could be assumed. One of the first steps in reconstructing the tragedy was analyzing the physical scene. Investigators documented the positions of Rob and Michelle's bodies, the displacement of furniture, and minor details that might indicate a struggle or confrontation. Every cup, book, or object out of place became part of the puzzle. Forensic experts sought to determine whether the act had been impulsive or premeditated, examining marks, fingerprints, and the arrangement of the home itself. These details, while seemingly mundane, provided critical clues to the sequence of events. Simultaneously, digital evidence became a focal point. Emails, text messages, and phone records were scrutinized for signs of planning, communication, or escalation. Early findings revealed ongoing disputes, discussions of finances and inheritance, and emotional exchanges that hinted at underlying resentment. Investigators pieced together not just the physical timeline of that day, but also the psychological trajectory that had led Nick to take such drastic action. Neighbors and friends were interviewed extensively. Their testimonies painted a picture of a family in apparent harmony on the surface, but troubled beneath. Small behaviors: a car parked outside for hours, hushed phone conversations, unusual pacing, were contextualized within the broader narrative of escalating tension. While these details may have seemed minor individually, collectively, they reinforced the emerging understanding that the tragedy was the culmination of long-standing issues, not a random act. As investigators delved deeper, the will emerged as a central piece of evidence. Discussions about the document, perceived slights, and long-standing grievances all became part of the narrative. Nick's motive, while initially framed as financial or symbolic revenge, appeared intertwined with deeper psychological and emotional dynamics. Experts emphasized that perceived betrayal